The twin-engine A-10 Warthog is not a subtle machine. It is ugly in the way a sledgehammer is ugly. It doesn't soar. It plods through the sky, a titanium bathtub wrapped in wings, built entirely around a 7-barrel Gatling gun that was designed to tear tanks in half. The pilots who fly it are a breed apart. They fly low, they fly slow, and they fly into places where the air is thick with shrapnel. Among them, few have a story like that of Colonel Kim K.C. Campbell. But to understand the weight of her legend, one must first strip away the polished metals and look at the raw fear of a single day in April 2003, before the war. Before the damage, Campbell was just a kid from Hawaii with a dream that, for a long time, was illegal. Growing up in the 1980s, she looked at the sky and saw freedom. She was captivated by flight, but the path was narrow. At that time, federal law prohibited women from flying in combat. When she arrived at the U.S. Air Force Academy, the statistics were brutal. She was entering a world where she would eventually become one of only 35 female fighter pilots out of roughly 3,500 in the entire Air Force. She was assigned the Call Sign Killer Chick, a moniker that initially made her uncomfortable. She didn't want to be a female pilot. She wanted to be a pilot, period. She wanted to be judged by her aim, her nerve, and her jet, not by her gender. The A-10 doesn't care about any of that. The jet is a pure meritocracy. It demands respect through sheer physical brutality. When the pilot pulls the trigger on the GA-U-8 Avenger, the cannon fires 70 rounds a second. The recoil is so powerful it slows the aircraft down. The smell of cordite fills the cockpit, and the plane shakes violently as it spits out depleted uranium shells. It is a flying machine gun, and Campbell mastered it. She deployed 6 times, logging hundreds of combat hours over Iraq and Afghanistan. She was good. But on April 7, 2003, being good meant being lucky. The storm over Baghdad. The sky over Baghdad was clouded with gray clouds. Operation Iraqi Freedom was in full swing, and American ground troops were pushing deep into the heart of the capital. They were taking fire, and they needed the hogs. Campbell, then a captain, was flying with her flight lead, checking in with the orbiting command and control aircraft, waiting for the call. The weather was a problem. To support the troops, they had to get under the clouds, low enough to see the targets, low enough to distinguish friend from foe. This meant descending into the muck, popping out in a narrow gap between the overcast and the rooftops. Right into the enemy's preferred engagement zone, she watched her flight lead disappear through a hole in the clouds. Then his voice crackled over the radio. He was in. It was her turn. Pushing the stick forward, Campbell dropped her Warthog through the gap. The world transitioned from gray murk to sharp, terrifying clarity. She was low, dangerously low, over a city at war. Below her, a firefight raged. She could see the bright flashes of small arms, the smoke trails of rockets, the chaos of urban combat. Her job was to bring the thunder. She rolled in on the target. Her systems locked on. She squeezed the trigger, and the hog shuddered violently as the 30mm rounds streamed downrange, tearing into the enemy position. The ground troops cheered. The threat was suppressed. It was a textbook gun run, but as she pulled off the target, wrenching the jet into a climb to set up for another pass, the world exploded. The hitty wasn't a sound, not really. It was more of a physical sensation, a massive, concussive thump against her back. The entire jet jumped, then lurched violently, its nose pitching down toward the Baghdad sprawl. In that split second, the sleek, responsive machine she had been flying turned into a dying hunk of metal. Smoke, and the acrid smell of burning hydraulics filled the cockpit. Red warning lights flashed across her control panel like a pinball machine. The master caution light blazed. Then came the voice of her wingman, urgent and strained. "You're hit. You're smoking. You've got massive damage." Campbell didn't need the confirmation. She could feel it. Her instinct, the ingrained muscle memory of thousands of hours of flight, screamed at her to pull back on the stick. She needed altitude. She needed to get out of the range of the small arms fire that was still reaching up for her. She hauled back on the control stick. Nothing happened. The stick moved loosely in her hand, disconnected, useless. It felt like a toy. The A-10, designed to be a rock-solid gun platform, was suddenly a falling stone, and she had no control. In the world of aviation, hydraulics are the muscles of the plane. They move the control surfaces, the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators. Campbell looked at her gauges and felt her blood run cold. The hydraulic pressure for both primary systems was reading 0. Not low, 0. A hit had severed the lines, dumping all the fluid into the wind over Baghdad. Every manual she had ever read, every training scenario she had ever simulated, ended the same way with that diagnosis. Total hydraulic failure meant the jet was unflyable. The standard procedure, the safe procedure, was to eject. The choice eject. The word burned in her mind. It was the rational choice. The jet was dying. She was sitting in a cockpit surrounded by smoke, with a sluggish, heavy feel to the airframe that told her pieces of it were missing or dragging in the wind. Below her was a hostile city. If she stayed with the plane, she might die in a crash. If she ejected, she would parachute down into the arms of Republican Guard soldiers who had been trying to kill her seconds before. Capture, torture, and death awaited her on the ground. She had terrible options, and she needed to pick one fast, but there was a ghost of a chance. A third option, one so dangerous it was never practiced in training. The A-10, built like a tank, had a backup system. It was a mechanical nightmare called manual reversion if the hydraulics were completely shot. A pilot could theoretically disconnect the flight controls from the hydraulic boosters and fly the plane using pure physical force. It meant moving the stick against the raw wind pressure. Using cables and pulleys like the pilots of World War I, it required immense strength. And it was incredibly easy to over-control and snap the wings off. No one trained for it because it was too risky. It was the aviation equivalent of performing your own open-heart surgery while running a marathon. Campbell looked at the ground rushing up. She looked at the instrument panel, at the red lights, at the loose stick in her hand. She thought about the stories of pilots who had come before her, the pioneers who had faced impossible odds and refused to quit. She thought about the troops on the ground who still needed cover. She thought about the simple promise she had made to herself to never give up until she had exhausted every single possibility. She made her choice. She was not going to eject. Reaching down, she flipped the guarded switch that engaged manual reversion. The change was immediate and terrifying. The jet felt like it was made of lead. Every input required a Herculean effort. The controls were sluggish, heavy, and responded with a delay that felt like an eternity. She had to wrestle the 40,000-pound machine back toward level flight, using muscles she didn't know she had, fighting the jet for every inch of altitude. The long flight homemesh leveled off. She was alive, still in the air, but the battle was just beginning. Baghdad was still below her. She needed to get out of the city, cross the desert, and find a friendly airfield. The nearest safe haven was in Kuwait, over an hour of flying time away. An hour of wrestling a crippled beast. Her wingman pulled up alongside her, his eyes wide as he took in the damage. The A-10 was shredded. Hundreds of holes peppered the fuselage. The tail section was mangled. One engine was damaged and surging. But the worst was underneath. "Your landing gear," he radioed, his voice grim. "It's hanging down. The doors are gone. The nose gear is cocked sideways." The damage to the hydraulics hadn't just affected her flight controls. It had gravity blasted the landing gear doors, and the wheels were partially deployed, hanging in the wind like a broken leg. If she tried to land like that, the gear would collapse, the plane would cartwheel, and she would die in a fireball. She had no hydraulics to retract the gear. She had no brakes. She had no flaps to slow her down. And she had no canopy. The explosion had damaged the seals. And wind roared through the cockpit at over 300 knots, making it hard to breathe, hard to see, hard to think. She was flying a skeleton for the next hour. Campbell entered a state of hyper-focus. She couldn't think about the fear. She couldn't think about the 360 enemy soldiers who had been shooting at her. She couldn't think about her family. She had to think about the jet. Every twitch of the wing required a massive correction. Every turn was a calculated risk that the airframe would fail. She had to keep the speed just right to slow, and she'd stall. Too fast, and she wouldn't be able to control the landing. Her wingman talked to her constantly, coaching her, describing the damage, keeping her calm. He became her eyes where hers couldn't see. Together, they flew south, leaving the smoke of Baghdad behind. The landingas, the desert airfield in Kuwait materialized on the horizon. The reality of the final challenge set in. She had one shot. If she messed up the approach, she couldn't go around. She had no hydraulics to add power quickly or adjust her attitude. It was a one-way trip, She had to land a 40,000-pound jet with no working brakes, no flaps, and no landing gear assurance, using only raw muscle power on the stick.